What's up, guys? Welcome to the show. Tyler's talking Olds RC. Oops, I messed up the intro there a little bit. I'm here with Tyler P. and Olin joining us again. World famous now after our last episode. Check it out if you haven't seen it. So we're talking electronics today, and specifically servos, ESCs, and motors. I know there's more electronics than that, but that's what we're focusing on today. And not so much what you should buy for whatever project you're doing, but more to understand certain specs when you're looking at buying a servo, and what to look for maybe your project, and different sizes and whatnot. So we're going to open up. I do have another camera set up today, so I'm trying that out. So those of you just listening, check it out on YouTube because I have more visuals today than I usually do. So what's going on, guys? Just chilling.
Yeah.
We're going to talk, let's talk servos first. So first up, I just grabbed a servo. So you're walking into the shop, you got a buggy, truck, crawler, whatever, and I get asked the questions a lot, what servo should I get? It's kind of a loaded question because one, we don't know what car you have, and two, what you want to spend and what you're trying to get out of the servo. So it really comes down to you knowing what the specs mean on the actual servo. This is where our little camera is going to come in handy, so we're going to talk about that a little bit. So you've walked in and you're checking out servos. So yeah, something like this. This is just a Servos 1258, just a regular base middle of the road servo. I know me, Tyler, and Olin use a lot in our buggies and whatnot.
Yep.
But you're looking at something like this. This is a standard 10 scale size servo, which is pretty much the most common. I didn't grab any other sizes today for the servos anyway. But this is the most common size. Usually get handed some kind of box like this. And on the back, it usually breaks it down. I don't know how well this little camera is going to do for me today, but we're gonna play with it. You got all your specs on the back here. So I'll let Tyler do some talking here while I take a break here. Go for it.
So you're going to have a few specs that are on the back of the box. The first one it's going to give you is torque. So because the servo is just an output spline, the first thing you're concerned with is basically how hard is it going to twist. So it's going to give you a number, usually in ounce, inches, or what's the other one? It gives it also in metric.
Usually kg, I believe.
Kilograms per centimeter?
I don't even know. Yeah, kilograms per centimeter. Yep.
All that means is how much pressure or how much force does it exert for a predefined torque. So instead of like foot-pounds, like with a car torque wrench, you're talking a much smaller thing, so it's ounce, inches, or kilograms, centimeters, whatever. It's just a measure of how hard the servo twists. So you'll see with a really high-end servo, they'll usually give that number on 6 volts of power or on 7.2 or 7.4 volts. And all that means is if you have the ability to control the voltage to the servo, it's going to just be a little bit more powerful on more voltage than on less. But that's really how strong the servo is what torque it outputs.
Yeah, so it's a little, I don't know how well this camera's picking, it's a little hard for me to see over there, but this servo, everything's rated at 6 volts, which is more or less the standard voltage that a normal ESC will output.
Yep.
Some servos rated 7.4, 8.4, 9.6, and they don't usually go much higher than that, but you have to look at what they're rating the torque at for the voltage, because if you buy a servo and all the ratings are at 7.4 volts, but you're just hooking it right into your receiver through a speed control outputting 6, you're actually going to be getting less torque than what the actual servo is, or what the box is telling you, basically. So take a look at what the voltage is rated at. I didn't grab one that had both ratings. I should have done that. But it'll be clearly marked at the top.
That also serves as a bit of a caution. If you're looking at a servo that only gives you the 6 volt torque, don't run it on 7.4 or a higher number. So this gets back to what Tyler said about know what the vehicle is, know what you're putting it in, and possibly know what your speed control is if it's not a ready to run vehicle or something like that. So you're buying the servo that can accept the power the ESC is giving it, and you don't have to worry about letting out the black smoke.
Yes.
Yeah, because you will burn out you'll burn it out.
Yeah, like Olin's saying here, and Tyler really. If you buy a 6-volt servo and you end up running at 7.4, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes it'll overheat and just burn out. It's kind of gambling at that point whether it'll work or not. But most servos will run at 6 volts. Go ahead, Tyler.
So apologies, audience. I just wanted to grab this too real quick.
Yeah.
So the other reading that they give you, and see it's shining out a little bit. Sorry. They're also going to give you a speed rating, and I think that's also dependent on the voltage because again, you give it more juice, it's going to be a faster, more powerful servo. But that gives you a way of gauging how fast that servo is. It's usually some amount of time for a certain amount of degrees of travel. And it's basically telling you, it can move this far in this much time. So if you're putting it in, in my world, a Clodbuster, a Blackfoot, whatever, it doesn't really matter. You can pretty much slap any servo in you want. It's going to do the job fine. If you're building a 10th scale, 2-wheel drive mod buggy or an 8th scale, off-road buggy, when you start getting into heavier stuff where you might want to be able to, tweak the car in the air using the steering and have more control, that's where you want a little bit higher speed servo.
Yeah, there's definitely different servos for different applications, and you have to kind of know, like coming into the store, what you're going to be putting it in.
Yep.
It'll definitely help out, just from working the counter, my recommendation to what you're doing. Like if you're going to put a servo into a rock crawler, the speed, like Tyler's saying, is not going to be as important as the torque.
Right.
But if you're putting in a 2-wheel drive buggy, the torque is not going to matter as much as the speed. And depending on your skill level, you may not want a really fast servo. You may want a slower servo. That kind of stuff. And then also going back to the rock crawling, because it's 2-wheel drive buggy and rock crawling are kind of the two extreme ends of servos in my opinion.
Right.
That's why I keep going back to it. Olin has some experience there on the rock crawling. So when you're doing the rock crawling, another thing with servos is you may have to run like a BEC, which is a battery eliminating circuit. Olin's built some crawlers. He knows what's going on here.
A few of them.
Yeah. So basically, that just bypasses the battery and runs voltage right to the servo. So depending on what your setup is, definitely. Take a look at the voltage and the speed. It may be more, you might need more speed, you might need more torque. But other than the speed, the torque, and the voltage, there's actually just the overall dimensions. Servos is pretty nice. They put it right on the box.
Yep.
Not all companies do that. This is a normal 10 scale servo, but there is some variances in the actual height and size of the servo. So some applications, some servos may fit and some may not, even though they're 10 scale servos.
And that includes the length of the whip that comes from the servo. Correct. So most servos are going to have, a 6 to 8 inch lead wire coming off of them. That's good for most purposes. In a 2-wheel buggy, if you know that's what's going in, you might say, well, do you have one with a short lead? That way you don't have all this wire that you have to manage. If you're building a crawler where your receiver is way far away from the servo, maybe the servo is front mounted or something, I'm not the crawler guy, then you need to know that you want the longer lead. Otherwise, you're going to have to get an extension harness and play that game. So, again, know the vehicle you're putting it in.
Correct. And then on top of that, you did mention BECs. You have to make sure that you're getting the correct BEC for your servo.
Well, you have to make sure you set the voltage correctly.
Correct.
Yeah, because they come set pretty low.
Right.
The Castle one is usually what we use, and you have to set the voltage. But you can set it from 5.5 to, I don't even know. No, it goes way high.
It goes higher than 7?
I don't even know. Like 14
I never went past 7, so I always
usually 7.4 is what a lot of these servos are rated for. And then circling back to the cord length, just speaking from Servos, because we sell a lot of the Servos servos. They're really good stuff. Like a lot of the racing ones, they sell like low profile versions of this will come with a cord that's like this long.
Right.
And then like the black edition servos. And this one comes with a regular length cord. It's probably, I don't know if you can, I'll have to do it up here, probably something like this. And then the crawler ones, they actually sell the waterproof versions. The black, they actually have a green case, like green paper in them. The cord's like this long.
Okay. So they're adjusting for the market that it's
Yeah,
intended
because
to.
you might have to run the servo from one end of the truck all to the other. But it's nothing that can't be solved with a simple servo extension if you do buy one with a short cord. So honestly, don't sweat it. It's, I mean, we do it all the time.
Right.
But yeah, just make sure the servo, you got your dimensions, whether maybe there's a height restriction, which I'm talking about from the spline to the bottom of the case. Make sure you get the right speed, torque for the application, and then obviously cost plays a factor in there too. There's just quite a difference between a $40 servo and a $140 servo.
Yeah.
Aluminum cases, steel titanium gears, bearings, waterproof. There's a whole spectrum.
But again, so I'm dating myself here, but if you go back to, 20 years ago in the hobby, the servos that most people put in their vehicles, I mean, not race vehicles, but like your average person putting something together, they were plastic gear.
Yep.
They had, this is rated what? 166 ounce inches, which is ridiculous. Like, that's a ton of torque. I think like a Futaba 3003 servo was like
terrible.
40 or 50 ounce inches. They were plastic geared. They didn't have bearings in them. So, I mean, if you walk in the shop today and you say, I have a blah, blah, I need just a run-of-the-mill servo, you're getting something that 20 years ago would have been like a $200 King of the Hill servo, with metal gears. And like, I ran the same 1258 in my original B6 for 5 years. It's still in the car. It still works.
Yeah, the 1258 is usually my go-to. That's why I just grabbed one for the video. But going to the 303, Servos makes one, I can't remember the number on it, but it's like $37, and it's metal gear, the same size as a 303, so a standard size, and it's like 130 ounces of torque.
Right.
And it's
half the price of that, and it's still
Yeah.
way superior to what used to come with like a regular pistol grip radio.
Correct.
That's crazy.
And if you're swapping out a servo, just go metal gear. Don't
Yes.
even bother plastic gear servos. It might have a good, the torque might be okay and the speed might be okay, but you're going to break the plastic gears if you're driving anything modern, honestly.
And the
Well-
rebuild kits are just as much.
Yeah, there's no point.
Right.
Rebuilding them is pointless.
Well, and most of your new race vehicles don't have servo savers in them.
No.
So there is, you need a strong servo. Otherwise, the servo becomes the thing that pops instead of, the wiper arm that
Right.
bolts to the servo.
In reality, it's
Yeah.
getting kind of hard to find a plastic gear servo anyway. I think Traxxas still does it in a couple ready-to-run trucks, but
Yeah. Once it pops, upgrade.
I mean, it's like, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
But I think that about covers servos. For any more questions, feel free to hit us up or message us or comment or, anything like that. I think that about wraps up servos. There's not much to talk about there. Let's move on to speed controls, ESCs, electronic speed controls, ESCs, speedos, all the same thing. There's a few different bits of lingo for those.
We're not going to talk about mechanical speed controls?
No, we're not going to talk about mechanical. Mechanical speed controls actually involve servos. So I guess we could talk about Segway.
We'll show them.
Segway.
We'll show them someday.
I don't have one of those because it's not 1985.
It was a good year.
It was a good year. I was not born for another 10.
Wow.
Yeah, think about that. I am the youngest one here.
Not
Anyway,
by much.
moving on to speed controls. Easy. Yeah, by a lot. Give me a break. We got a few here, a few sizes. This is a speed control hooked to a motor, which motors we're going to talk in a minute. Playing with the other camera here, so forgive me. So this is a Hobbywing XR10 Pro. This is one new in the box here, so you can check that out. This is what I consider to be a higher end 10 scale buggy racing speed control. Also used in the drag cars quite a bit. I got it in my drag Corvette over here behind us. This is probably my favorite speed control for the racing application, hands down. Tekin makes also great quality stuff. But I'm not really here to talk about brands. So speed controls, obviously, there's quite a few ratings on those, and the same with servos. It depends on what you're putting it in. Definitely a spread, more of a spread on speed controls than there is servos. This one is considered for 10 scale racing. I have this one here is what comes in actually a Corrali car, which is a 1/8 scale bashing car.
Slightly larger.
Yep. So now that Tyler, yeah, it's larger. So usually, the bigger the car, the bigger the speed control. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. More amps, more voltage, bigger motors. So I'll let Tyler do a little bit of talking, or Nolan here, whoever wants to go, talking basically what scale speed control and what scale speedo you put in it.
Well, so I guess for most of your 10 scale stuff, 10 scale is kind of a tricky thing too, because all the carpet cars we run are 10 scale.
Right.
They run 2-cell lithium, which is 7.4 volts nominal.
Right.
But a lot of basher stuff is 10th scale, but is running 3S and 4S and stuff like that. So it's a little bit trickier. But in general, when you're in the market for an ESC, you want to know what you have for batteries. So do you have what's the voltage of the battery? Is it a 2-cell, which would be 7.4 volts, or is it 3, which would be 11.1, et cetera, et cetera. So the higher the voltage, usually the beefier the ESC you need. And the same is true with how much or how hot of a motor you're going to put behind it. So if you're going to put a really crazy motor behind it, you need a speed control that can handle the current that motor is going to pull. It's kind of a rabbit hole, because when you increase voltage, you also increase RPM, which increases current draw as well. So basically, if you're putting something together that's going to be stupid fast, you better make sure you size your ESC correctly so that you don't pop it.
So we got a lot of. So I just grabbed this Tekin one. Olin grabbed this one earlier because it's got a lot of specs on the back of it. So really, I ask, one, what's it going in, obviously, for scale wise, but then what are you planning on doing with the car? Because that's pretty important. You're going to either run big batteries in it and go for speed, or you're running more conservative, you're looking to run the car longer. So we'll stick with the 1/10, 1/8 scale, because it's kind of what we got in front of us here. So this is an RX-8, which is considered a higher end racing speed control for a 1/8 scale. Yep. And they list a bunch of specs on the back here, so I'll let you guys see that, and we'll kind of go over this because I think it'll segue us into a lot of things. So right off the bat, leading into it, it's got the BEC voltage, which is what we were talking about before with the servos. So a lot of speed controls have built-in BECs, which is going to allow you to turn from 6 volts, usually to 6 to 7.4 volts, to get more power out of your servo.
The BEC circuit is literally for feeding the servo and the receiver.
Correct.
It gives the receiver power so that it can see the radio, and it gives the servo power so it can act on the commands. That circuit is just for those two things.
Yeah, and so the BEC is one thing to take a look at, and then there is a motor limit. Most speed controls will have a motor limit either in turns or kV, which we'll talk more about when we talk about motors. But basically, it's what the company has said, this speed control with this voltage can power this motor with no problems. I mean, it's going to build heat that if you're running it right on the edge. But if you're going to be running, say, I don't know, you got a 10 scale car and you're going to run a really fast motor in it, you may have to get like an 8 scale speed control to output the current.
Well, that's what a lot of the drag guys are finding, right?
Right, so a lot of the drag guys are running 10 scale, but they're running 8 scale speed control to a 1/10 scale motor because it's asking for so much amp draw that a 10 scale speed control is actually struggling a little bit. That being said, I do run a 10 scale speed control in my drag car, but albeit it is a $200 10 scale speeder. But really, it's going to come down to what motor you want to run and how much voltage you're going to be putting to it.
Yep.
Because most 10 scale motors, or speed controls, excuse me, will do 2 to 3 cell. And then most 8 scales will usually go to 4 to 6. And then there goes in the 5th scale, which usually goes 8 plus cell.
Oof.
Yeah, we're getting crazy. I did bring a big motor, so we'll check that out after. So you really got to know what scale you're putting it in, and then really what you're looking to do. If you're going for straight speed runs, you're going to put a massive motor in this thing, and it's going to draw all kinds of current. You're going to need a big speed control. Like this Tekin, for example, it has an amp draw with a 300 amp constant and a 1,000 amp burst.
So let's talk about that.
That's important.
When you're looking at those two ratings, the constant is exactly what it sounds like it means. It means that ESC can deliver that many amps. 300, was it 300 for this one?
Yeah, that's what it says here.
Or 100 to 150 for like a 10th scale job. It means it can deliver that more or less indefinitely. If you don't think about the battery dying, it can deliver that happily with no overheating issues. It won't pop. It won't have any heartburn. When it talks about peak or surge or inrush, or there are different terms for it. That other number, which will always be higher, is a momentary number. So when you whack the throttle on a car, that is the highest demand that motor will pull from the ESC. And you'll see on a dyno, if you have one,
Check out the dyno video.
you'll see this peak, and then immediately after the peak, it'll the current draw will start to come back down. So that's the inrush. That's that peak number to kind of get through that initial of getting the car moving when you whack the throttle. And again, it's not something that you're going to live at. So don't use that number to then go size the motor. Well, I've got a 3.5 that's going to pull 450 amps or whatever it is. Use the continuous number. That's your safe number. The other one is kind of hard to quantify, to be honest.
And a lot of the guys dial back the burst or that initial peak power that they get right off the bat anyway, because if you don't, the car's not going to be controllable. So
Right.
You have all that power, yes, but you can't put it to the pavement all at once because the tires are going to spin. So you got to be careful of that also. Just because you have that power doesn't mean you should use it right off the gate.
Right. So like in the full-scale drag racing world, use the illustration of like nitrous. You may have a 300 horsepower shot of nitrous on your car, but you're not, as soon as you get off the line, going to whack the car with 300 horse. You're going to spin the wheels. It's not going to be controllable.
Correct.
So when you pull that back, it's like guys run a nitrous controller on their cars where that 300 horsepower shot gradually ramps in over 3, 4, 5 seconds as you head down the strip.
Correct.
So that you can still maintain grip and hook and so forth. So that's cool. They're doing the same thing in the little cars.
Right.
Yeah, you guys are talking about like setting a profile inside the speed control for that.
Yeah, that's kind of going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's getting a little deep. So basically what they're talking about is a lot of these higher end speed controls have you can hook them to software and change the actual curve of power, which is nice. So that's something to consider too when you're looking, what you want to do with the speed control. We're talking drag racing. Because drag racing got pretty hot this year, and going back to the current. If sometimes, say you have a 10 scale motor, sometimes when you whack it off the line, it's actually drawing too much current for a 10 scale speed control to handle it. So you might have to attach an 8 scale speed control to a 10 scale motor in order to handle that current limit. Because essentially what happens is when you hit that throttle initially, I call it hitting like a rev limiter, but it's really a current limiter. The speed control will actually only put out what it can put out. So the motor will actually make like a Cogging, it'll it hits us like a rev limiter. The motor will like something like that. I see it a lot more, not so much with the drag racing. I see it more with speed running. When someone is doing speed runs and they're ringing out their motor, their speed control, full timing, boost, which is all programmable settings in certain speed controls. It's hitting basically that like 1,000 amps when we're talking about the RX-8. It's hitting that. And the speed control can't output any more, but the motor is asking for more.
Right.
So it's actually hitting a wall. And I get it. I hear it a lot from people where the car will actually like stutter at wide open throttle. Basically, the motor paired with that battery is asking for more power than the speed control can put to it.
Interesting.
So you have to keep in mind the amp draw of what you're trying to do. And I know that might be going over some people's heads, which I'm sorry. if you're coming in to look for a speed control to upgrade your car because it's not, your motor is asking for too much power, just go. I call it going +1 on the speed control.
Yeah.
Okay, so for me, like in my racing car, speed control wise, I have a Max 6, which is rated for 8 cell, but I run it on 4, sometimes 5 cell. So I'm pretty underrating the speed control. So it runs cooler. I'm never drawing the max amount of amps that it can put out. The car never stutters or shudders. It likes the power. So I've bought a bigger speed control than my motor is asking for power.
You've oversized the system.
Correct.
Basically, so you have that extra margin.
Yeah. So if you're always safer to get a bigger speed control than a smaller speed control. When in doubt, just get a bigger one.
Right.
And I mean, cost-wise, we're talking. I mean, these are high-end ones that we grabbed. I'll give you that. But this is an RX-8 for $220, and this is an RX-10 Pro, which is Hobby Wing, for $200. I believe this goes for, and $220. So this is a $20 difference. But this RX-8 will put out more amps than this RX-10. So just keep that in mind when you're shopping around. If you can afford to go a hair bigger and you got the space for it, you're always safe putting a bigger speed control with a smaller motor.
As long as the application warrants it.
And the car can fit it.
Right, because the speed control doesn't really care what motor it's pushing. You can put a little tiny motor with a massive speed control, as long as the speed control run on set, the voltage matches up.
Yep.
You go too crazy. You want a speed control this big and a motor this small. Within reason. But you could run an 8 scale speed control with a regular 10 scale motor, and the speed control will run cooler, and generally the motor run a little bit cooler too because there's no restriction in amp draws or anything like that.
Well, and you'll see that sometimes, like with short course, you'll see two wheel drive short course trucks using a standard 10th scale 2-pole motor, like that X Factor there or whatever.
Yeah.
But they'll run an 8th scale ESC.
Right.
Because it's a big, granted it's a 2-wheel drive truck, but it's bigger, it's heavier, so you run a speedo that can handle the current draw, and it's not going to overheat, it's not going to be grumpy or unhappy. They usually also have a slightly stronger BEC, so the bigger the size ESC, generally, the more power it can give the servo. So, going back to like the 4-wheel drive days with short course, guys were having issues where their ESCs would brown out because, like, the old Mambas couldn't provide enough power to the servo in a 4-wheel drive short course.
Right.
So again, this is where a bigger ESC, like you said, Olem, if you can fit it, it's not hurting you to have it in the car.
I do want to touch on the BEC real quickly. If you do turn your BEC up to 7.4 volts, you have to make sure your receiver can handle it.
Ooh, good point.
Because that gets glazed over a lot. A lot of ready-to-run trucks, receivers are rated for 6 volts. If you have an aftermarket radio, generally it's rated for 7.4, but you are going to want to check to make sure your receiver is rated for it.
Yeah, good point.
Because you will blow up the receiver, essentially. The servo, it may be fine, the speed control may be fine, but the little receiver everything gets plugged into may not be fine with it. So double check that. I get asked that one a lot. Just a little sidebar there. So check out your receiver and make sure that everything's going to drive at 7.4 volts. It should all be written down in the specs of your receiver.
And one other thing that we don't want to skip over is some motors are only censored and they can only run on a censored ESC.
Right, we got to talk about that.
Because if you try to run a censored motor on a non-censored ESC, you're going to have that clogging issue that you were referring to earlier.
The Cogging, yeah, you're right. So we got to talk about censored and non-censored, which applies to ESCs and motors, but we're just going to talk about the speed control portion of it right now. So what Olin is saying, I don't know, I guess this Tekin is the easiest. I don't know.
This one's not censored, so...
Yeah, so this Tekin has this little port, just trying the best I can here to show you, on the side, which is a sensor port, which is essentially a wire that connects.
You can see it on that guy right there.
Yeah, this is actually a better example. Thank you. So we got, let's see, this cable here is actually called a sensor cable, which is connected to the back of the speed control to the back of the motor. So the back of the motor has a, sensor board, rightly named, and the speed control has a sensor board. And essentially, as far as I know, all this cable does is monitor where the rotor is inside of the motor. So essentially, it starts up smoother because it applies power to the correct magnet in the motor, so the rotor spins without cogging. So speaking of cogging, I guess we could explain cogging a little bit. I'll let Tyler talk about it because he's messing with motors and the dynos and whatnot. So, what's
good.
cogging? What's
good.
cogging, Tyler?
Cogging is usually, so I'll describe what it is physically. It's usually manifest in the car when you give it some throttle, and instead of the car smoothly just taking off, you get this sort of cogging. It's this kind of notchy, jittery behavior where the car doesn't want to take off, and you can usually kind of work around it. Like if you give the car a push, and as it's rolling, you get on the throttle. Once it gets past kind of an idle or a crawl, it tends to go away. It can be caused, by a bunch of different symptoms, but at the end of the day, it boils down to not having your motor and your ESC, assuming everything else is right, matched to each other. If the ESC is expecting to see this little cable, and it doesn't, it doesn't have the data it needs to drive the motor. And there are some ESCs that are sensored only. There are some that are censored and sensorless. There are some that are sensorless only. Mm-hmm. So again, this gets back to if you're buying one of those two pieces, the motor or the ESC, know what the other one is.
Correct.
So that you can, when you come in, you can get the mating part right.
Yeah, let's see. I don't know if the speed control box says it. I know the motor box does.
Usually the high-end stuff will run sensorless, but what you'll find is it doesn't have the same amount of pop off the line. It'll feel soft, almost like turbo lag in a car. Because whenever somebody's sensor wire goes bad or their sensor board goes bad,
I call that the two-step.
Yeah.
Basically, you just hammer it full throttle, and the car will do like a.
Yep.
Basically, your car will feel like it has no torque at all off the line.
Yep.
And then it'll take off and go because the motor doesn't. No, excuse me. The speed control doesn't really know where the motor's at, so it's just throwing power at it, and then it figures it out and goes.
Right. Most of these ESCs have algorithms built into the software in them, where they can fire the pulse because you have your three legs, so it'll fire the three legs. And it's looking for, without going too deep into this, it's looking for feedback through the other unactivated legs. So it'll fire A and it'll watch B and C. And that's how it can tell whether it's rotating forward or backwards. That's why sometimes a sensorless setup, when you first get on the gas, I know I've seen some of the Traxxas cars do this, they'll sort of they'll burp and then they'll go.
Right. If
they're not totally happy.
Kind of stutters.
That's the ESC playing with the way it's firing the motor to get it to see the right rotation, and then once it sees it, it goes, okay, I got to go ACB, whatever the pattern is. So a lot of the ESCs are smart enough to figure that out, but they want to see what they're programmed to see. So if it's a censored ESC, plug the wire in if you have the right motor. If you don't, then you're kind of going to be behind that.
You need that wire plugged in. I get asked that one a lot. Do I need to plug in this wire? Yes. If it's a censored motor and a censored speed control, you need the sensor wire plugged in. Right. Otherwise, the car is going to have absolutely no bottom end, and you're going to wonder why it's so slow.
Yep. It's the speed feedback.
And if you have an uncensored system with uncensored motor, uncensored speed control, it is okay that it stutters when you're barely holding the throttle.
Yep.
And it does this.
Right.
That's perfectly normal because that's something brought up to me a lot as well. It's just the censored speed control in the motor gives you the smoothness. The uncensored is usually cheaper, which is why it's uncensored. And also usually it has better water resistance being uncensored.
Well, because it's one less port to have to seal.
You don't have to cover up a port. So that's something to consider too, is actually being waterproof, to segue into that. An uncensored system, like I got this speed control here. This is just a basic ready to run speed control. it's uncensored. The only ports are the ones in the front and the one that goes to the speed control. This is considered a waterproof speed control. I think it's out of a Corrali car. Uncensored, just 3 pulls in, and that's it. There's no sensor port to cover up to try to make waterproof or anything like that.
Right.
So, censored and sensorless really has its place. One's not really better than the other, in my opinion. I think censored electronics are better on like a racing car.
Yeah.
Where taking off faster, smoother, or checking. You get to check more settings and parameters in the motor when there's a sensor board, like the dyno and whatnot.
Well, and that's what that sensor board is what enables the ESC to give you adjustable timing, adjustable boost, and all these other things, because it lets the ESC know exactly what RPM and at what point to fire the different phases. So I think the sensorless ones, true or false, usually have less of those features.
Yeah, you
I
can't
don't
really.
think they have them.
Yeah.
So that's
sensorless.
then there you go.
Sensorless systems, you can't really see what's going on with the motor. It just doesn't know. It's only got power going to it.
Right.
Like with a censored system, like this Hobbywing system here with the Trinity motor, this is your typical 10 scale racing setup. This sensor wire will allow you, the speed control, to actually see like the last motor temperature, the phase timing, and all kinds of fun stuff that is probably over some people's heads, but it gives you more information about the motor. But if you're just bashing around the yard, you probably don't care about that stuff.
You're arguably worse off with a high-end censored system.
For sure.
Because most of your really powerful censored motors are like that Trinity, where I don't want that in a basher car.
No.
It's completely open and exposed. So they're serving 2 different legs of the hobby, which is fine. If I have a basher, I just want something that's stupid fast, and I can pull the trigger and it goes in the direction I want it to.
That's what I'm and that's what I'm saying. It's like this setup here is an easy $300, where you can get a equivalent speed, probably faster, for half the cost, uncensored.
Right.
And it'll be waterproof, just as fast, and
all that.
probably take a bigger beating.
Correct.
So you got to know the application for the speed control that you're looking at. If you're bashing or racing, there's going to be better options for one or the other. Just to wrap up speed controls, you got to know what you're putting in to scale. If you're looking to get speed out of it, or torque, or there's crawling, when you're coming up to the counter, I need a good speed control for a crawler or a 10 scale buggy. If the person working the counter has any idea what's going on, they should have a pretty good recommendation for what you need.
And this is how big my battery is.
Yeah.
This is how many volts I'm running.
I'm looking to run 6 cell in this car, or 3 cell. Your car may not be built for it, but you can put the electronics in it to make it do it sometimes. But the car not being built for it, that's a whole nother show, I guess.
Yeah.
Some cars, you can't put 8S power into a 10 scale buggy. It's just not, within reason here. But anyway, that would be fun though. Olin will do it next.
Oh yeah, I've definitely done it.
No. But anyway, so that's mostly speed controls. There's current, your BEC voltage. We didn't even talk about brushed. All brushless. Most things are going brushless these days. Even crawling, the minis, everything's going brushless. And really all brushless, to know the difference between brushed and brushless real quick, 3 wires, 2 wires. Brushless is 3 wires, brushed has 2, which is positive and a negative. Okay? Yep. Brushed is really getting phased out. A few ready to run cars still coming with it, and it's still somewhat popular in the crawling scene, but brushless is coming in pretty fast there too. So pretty much just know what you're looking to get and know what you're looking to put it in. What voltage, what car, what size, and just have a general idea of what you're looking to do. And don't be afraid to ask some questions about it, because I know it can be pretty overwhelming. There's a lot of different speed controls and a lot of different motors.
Yep.
And not everything has been tested together. There's combinations of speed controls and motors that may work in your car that maybe I haven't put in there yet. But there's definitely a lot of tested motors and speed controls.
Yeah.
With that being said, we'll segue into motors here, which kind of goes hand in hand with speed controls, really, seeing as how you can't use one without the other. We'll segue right in. We were talking about censored and sensorless, which motors are the same thing. You either have a sensor port or you don't. If it doesn't, like this one, got a lot of glare there, sorry. No sensor port. That's usually located on the back of the motor. Go back to that Trinity one. So you can check that out real quick. Is this motor censored or sensorless? Well, take a look at the back real quick. If there's no sensor port, you're sensorless. If there's a sensor port, you're censored. That's pretty much the end of that one.
Yeah.
But again, it goes back to knowing what you're going to put it in and the size. So I got a couple here. This is considered 10 scale, 8 scale, 10 scale. So we got a few motors here. But I don't know, you guys want to talk about turns to kV? Because that's a big one, turns versus kV. I can talk. You want me to talk?
Go ahead.
All right. I'm talking a lot today. I love talking about electronics.
I was giving the nod to Olin.
No, I talked enough last time.
Well, so kV and turns give you two different things. They're both used to characterize how fast it is. Turns is literally an indication of how many times the copper wire on the stator. I don't know if you can maybe show it on that X Factor motor.
Yeah, I'll try. It's pretty cut out, so
yeah.
I can try.
The turns are how many times that copper wire is wrapped around the stator. End of discussion. It was the same back in the brush days too.
Yeah.
Normally, the lower the number, the faster the motor. All other things being equal. kV is an indication of how many RPM the motor produces per volt of battery. So if you have a 1 kV motor on 10 volts, it'll make 10 RPM, just making the math simple. So kV and turns are supposed to be ways of indicating how fast the motor is. You'll see some motors use kV, some motors use turns. It kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're running carpet buggy or dirt buggy, you care turns because that's what you're limited by, is 17.5 or 13.5 or whatever.
So basically, what I've noticed in the motor world is kV is generally used for uncensored motors. Not always, because Castle does this. And turns is generally in for censored motors.
Oh, I never thought about that.
If you look at most censored motors, like the ones I got here, 13.5, this is a 10.5, this is a little mini LC Racing one it's for the LC Racings that we got, we'll be selling those. And then if you look at this motors that are uncensored, notice how they're rated in kV. Why they do that, I can't really tell you, to be honest with you, but
because you could rate either motor the same way.
Exactly. I think mostly it comes down to racing and just the history of racing being rated in turns.
Yeah. Well, so you can regulate the number of turns around the stator. Yeah. And that's what when you have like a Roar certified motor, it's gone through an inspection process to make sure that it's legal for racing. And that's part of that process, is checking the diameter of the wire and how many loops around the stator it goes. The reason they don't use kV is because you can change the timing on a motor and wildly change the kV. I've seen this on the motor that we dynoed for the guy with the green car. He had the timing turn way up. The car made 5,500 kV. That would be like an insanely low turn brushless motor. Mm-hmm. When we adjusted the timing back to something normal, it was 3,200 kV. Same motor. So I think that's part of why they don't do that with those, is because they're adjustable timing, whereas a lot of your sensorless stuff probably is not. Those are fixed, aren't they?
Right, so we can segue into that now that you brought up the timing there.
It's a good time for it.
Good time. Good time for timing. So what Tyler's referring to, I don't know if this little guy has timing. I don't think so. We'll talk about the
That one
Trinity because it definitely has it.
Yeah, you can see the
Right there
marks.
on the side.
So, if we see the scale on the side, which I'll circle back to Tyler because he's the motor timing expert here. Essentially, you can adjust the timing up or down a certain amount of degrees to get more RPM or torque out of a motor. This is what he's referring to as being adjustable. The actual end bell will spin the sensor board and adjust the timing, whereas this one here is just lock timing. It's set at 3200 kV. You can't change it. It is what it is. It's just 3 bolts holding it in the back, and that's your typical, your typical ready to run motor is usually just a fixed timing,
Right.
rated in kV uncensored motor. And Tyler can explain the kV a little bit more because he's been dabbling a lot in that lately. Or the timing. Sorry.
So I'll go back. I always use automotive illustrations. So if you had like an old V8 engine, you have your distributor with ignition timing. And it's almost the same thing here. The timing tells you how early the spark fires for the engine. And you can have too much timing or too little timing. And both scenarios will result in a motor that runs like poo. There is, for every engine, an optimal timing where you will make peak horsepower, peak torque, and you won't detonate the brains out of the motor and blow it up on the dyno for a gas engine. With these, it's very similar. What you're doing is you're advancing the sensor board against the stator of the motor. So you're kind of tricking the ESC into firing the phases, the A, B, C, earlier or later than it thinks it is. So what that can do, if you have really low timing, it tends to produce less RPM and more torque and more power. When you crank the timing all the way up, like the example I mentioned just a second ago, you're going to get a ton more RPM, a ton more kV, but you're going to be way softer on horsepower, way softer on torque. The other trade-off is efficiency. When you time the ever-loving bejesus out of a motor, your efficiency goes down the toilet. Like you can lose as many as 5 to 15 % of efficiency by going overboard on the timing. So there's this sweet spot, which if you have an inertial dyno, you can, shameless self-promotion, you can figure that out through, an experimentation process and looking at what the chart looks like and all that stuff. But again, that's what, censored motors give you, is the ability to play with that. So if you have a track with a ton of straightaway, maybe you want that RPM, and you're willing to give up, the horsepower and the efficiency. Or if you have a tight, twisty track, maybe you want more torque, you turn the timing down. But there's a lot to it. Even as I kind of dig in with the dyno, it's
Yeah, that's a whole nother
show
in itself.
It's a rabbit hole for
And
sure.
We'll have more videos about that when Tyler, we work with the dyno a little bit more. But just to break it down for the average guy, a lot of timing can be really bad. Not enough timing can be really bad. There's really a point in the motor where everything works.
Goldilocks syndrome.
Probably. And honestly, finding that point is easier said than done. But just because you can advance and I guess retard the timing doesn't mean
You should.
it doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's not taking anything away from a motor that you can.
Right.
If you don't know what you're doing with timing, then there's really no point in really messing with it, honestly.
Yeah.
I threw that motor in my buggy and that's it. I really don't dig into it too much as Tyler. It's this whole nother side of the hobby in itself.
It's so much fun.
When you're up at the counter and you're looking for a motor for your car, don't be discouraged because it's a locked can motor or basically a motor you can't adjust the timing versus one that you can. But generally, depending on what you're putting it in, like if you're bashing, most of your motors are going to look kind of like this, like I had mentioned before. Just sealed can motors. There's less things to go wrong. It's not censored. It's usually waterproof, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, and you can't get into as much trouble that way either.
That's what I'm saying.
You crank up the timing, and now you can overheat the motor, and you can do all sorts of bad things.
Yeah, timing is all fun, and usually, and then that comes with being a censored motor. If it's a non-censored motor, there's no timing to mess with. And censored versus non-censored in a nutshell, one is not better than the other.
Yeah.
but one may be better for one application than the other.
Right. It's like diesel versus gas.
Right. So
Honda versus Ford.
I don't know if that's a battle right now. Illinois is trying to work in his Honda. But just know what you're going to be putting your motor and your speed control in is really what it comes down to. And if you came up to me, hey, I'm building a four-wheel drive short course truck and I just want to beat it around my yard. All right, no problem.
You're going to get an A-scale system.
Yeah, you're going to get either an A-scale system that's, we're running on 3-cell or something that's a little bit, it'll run cooler and longer. Or you're going to get a 10-scale system that's not censored and, you run it on 2-cell and it's a little milder. It really comes down to how aggressive and crazy you want to be with these electronics. Because
how much you
I don't know if
spend.
it brings me to another, about my little camera. Brings me to another thing with these motors that I forgot to mention is the bolt pattern on a lot of these motors is pretty standard. So like this motor will bolt into the same plate as this motor, but they're significantly different sized. So, and I think this is even the same bolt pattern as this, to be honest with you.
They are pretty much the same.
So the bolt pattern on these motors is pretty standard. So you can actually it's pretty easy to put an incorrect motor in not the right car or vice versa. So keep that in mind. Just because it bolts in doesn't mean it's a good pick for your car.
If it fits, it ships.
If you went and put this Trinity 13.5 in a four-wheel drive short course truck, just because it bolts up, you're gonna burn it right up. It's not made for it at all.
It's gonna be a dog.
But on the other hand, this one would have bolted up and it would have been an animal and never got hot. So just because it bolts up does not mean it's a good one. I see that a lot.
So it gets back to, and I feel like this is like a running theme with this podcast. Know what you have and what you're doing with it. If you come in here and you can, even if it's just take pictures of the truck, if you don't remember what it's called, if you can come in here and the more information you can give the guy behind the counter, the better the odds. If you don't know what you want, if you're not willing to say, give me one of these, come in with the information.
Right.
And let Tyler, let Chris, let Olin, use their wisdom, and if you give them the information, they'll get you what you want.
Right.
Yeah, and also the one thing about KV that I forgot to mention and turns. So the higher the KV number, which I don't know if we touched on, the higher the KV number, more RPM.
Yes.
Did go over that.
And
Yeah, I didn't say it explicitly though. You're right.
So higher KV, more RPM. Lower KV, more torque. Okay? And it's the opposite in turns.
Right.
So higher turns, more torque. Lower turns, more RPM.
Yeah.
This is pretty important because if you put a 7,000 kV motor on 3-cell in a 10-scale car, it's going to get very hot. If you put a 3,800 kV motor in a 10-scale car on 3-cell, it'll be just fine.
Happy as a
It'll
clam.
like it.
Yeah.
And the same goes for turns, just the opposite. So if you're looking for flat out speed, I just want to run this thing one time to see how fast I can get it to go. High voltage and high kV, the way to go.
Yep.
But if you're looking to drive this car around, go lower on the kV and a little bit lower on the voltage, and it'll run much cooler. Because a lot of times, these motors, you put a big high kV motor on wicked voltage, the motor will just go until it blows up. It'll take the voltage and it'll explode. The rotors will just explode. It'll just go. They can only hold on to so many. We're talking 100,000 RPMs out of a motor. Yeah, it's crazy. So that's something that gets brought to me a lot. So KV and turns, make sure you're getting the right one for your application, because usually high KV, high voltage, more heat, more speed. And a little bit lower, you get a little more control, and usually drive it longer. So that's something to keep in mind for motors. And then talking about voltage, I think did we get everything on motors? We didn't talk about shaft size. That's pretty important.
And gearing, but
Tyler, give me a smirk over here.
Phrasing.
Keep it PG. But anyway, shaft size is pretty important because there's actually quite a few sizes. I didn't even bring out the big shaft.
That's ridiculous. That's out of a 5.
Where's the smirk on that one?
I'm.
He held it together.
You're not gonna bait me. I'm an adult.
All right, so this one, so shaft size is important for deciding pinion gears and whatnot. So usually there's a few sizes. So this is considered a 1/8 inch or 3 millimeter, which is essentially the same thing, which is your typical 10 scale racing motor, or a lot of 10 scale size 540 can motors, which is this size. That's your 1/8 or 3 millimeter shaft. Then the next size up is generally a 5 millimeter, which can be found on some 10 scales and most 1/8 scale motors, pretty much all of them actually. I don't think there's any small, which is 5 millimeter, which is the actual diameter of the shaft, which is correspond to the bore of the pinion gear that you have to buy to fit on this. And then after that, it goes up to 8 millimeter, which is it's pretty huge actually.
1/3 of an inch.
Yeah, 8 millimeter. And then there may be a size after that, like 10, but I've usually only had to mess with 8 is the largest I've had to deal with. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's not that one is really better than the other, but when you're buying gears, you have to know the actual bore and shaft size. Otherwise, you're going to buy a gear that doesn't fit your motor. So know when you buy the motor, either ask, what pinion gear, what's the shaft size on this motor, or if you're coming in to buy a gear, just know what size you got.
Yep.
I mean, or bring the motor.
Bring the old one.
Bring the motor with
bring
you.
the motor.
And then let us know what car it's going into also.
Yeah, because there's different pitch, but that's getting into gearing. But the shaft is pretty important, so just try to remember that. But I think that's about it for motors. Again, any questions, hit me up, shoot a comment, and I'll try to get back to you. But moving on from the speed controls to the motors, we'll talk about batteries. Voltage, what's going on with batteries? I'll clear some of this stuff out of the way. Batteries are probably the most simple thing we're going to talk about this evening. Sorry if we get a little technical. We're just really into this hobby.
Nerds.
Batteries. I just grabbed a couple basic
Passionate.
2 cells.
Sure. Whatever helps you sleep at night.
Just passion.
I own it.
So these are just 2 cells. I mean, there's not a whole lot to batteries. You want to do some talking, Olin? We've been quiet over there this evening.
Sure. So, like Tyler said earlier, batteries, they come either in 7.4, 11.2, 14.
How high can Olin go? How high can he go?
8.
Do the math.
Shush. Stop.
What comes after 14.8? Anyway.
I quit.
What Olin?
But anyway, so
how high can you count?
2 podcasts.
But most people don't go more than 4 cell batteries.
Well, that basically what you're referring to is the cell count.
Correct. But what I was saying is the 2, 3, and 6. The average basher doesn't go more than 4. If you're going
6,
not the average.
yeah, we're going global.
Okay. All right. And then there's 6S2, but for the most part, most people either use 2 or 3.
We'll talk about 2 cells. We got them right
Okay.
there.
So 2 cells, they range. It depends on there's different sizes in 2 cells.
Olin, what do you mean by cells?
Cells?
Yeah.
Okay.
What the heck is a cell?
A cell.
We're teaching them about that.
Well,
What the heck is a cell?
A cell is a 2 cell battery has 2 cells in each battery. Obviously.
Oh my god.
You know what? I'm done.
I'm just busting up Olin here.
So puff your lipo and find out. So
Right.
it's quite literally 2 little
it's a
lipo
cell.
bags.
It's
2
They're
cells.
they're 2 little self-contained little baggies.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is basically just a little lithium polymer cell inside, and I mean, there's different compositions of batteries, chemistry. We're talking about lithium polymer, which is LiPo, lipo for short.
Right.
So it literally is 2 cell for a 2 cell battery. I was just giving Olin a hard time. But there's 2 cells in there. Basically, a nominal value for a cell is 3.7 volts. When I say nominal, that's not dead, not fully charged.
At rest, basically.
50% capacity
Right.
is nominal. So a dead cell would be 3 volts, and a fully charged cell should be about 4.2 volts. So every battery is rated at nominal value. So a 2-cell will be rated at 7.4 volts, which is 3.7 times 2.
Right.
I held up 4 fingers.
So
2.
hashtag math.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why, like, if RC started in the last few years, there would be no mention of cells.
No.
They would say voltage, and that would be it. The reason that they use this antiquated verbiage is because back in the old days, when you ran, NiCad or nickel metal packs, you had literally 6 C-size little round metal batteries that would get chained together. So you had a 6-cell battery.
What do they call those batteries, Tyler? For our listeners out there, what was the composition?
NiCad or nickel metal.
Yeah, but a lot of people ask me what the abbreviation means. NIMH and NICD.
Nickel cadmium or nickel metal hydroxide, I think.
Nickel metal hydride.
Hydride, yeah.
But I get asked that a lot, so that's why I was testing you.
That's like your brushed Traxxas ready to run battery or something. But anyway, so back then, each of those cells was 1.2 volts, I want to say.
Yes.
Lithium is totally different. Lithium is 3.7 volts per cell, so that's why you end up with a 2-cell pack. And like I said, if you puff it, you'll find that there's 2 little black baggies inside.
Or silver.
Silver, yeah.
Yeah.
Olin knows about that.
Depends what flavor of China.
Puffed up a couple.
Yes, so it's a lithium polymer, which is the main composition of the battery. And the puffing up that they're talking about is essentially the chemical reaction on the inside has gone south. Either it's been overcharged or
Undercharged.
over discharged. And I'm not a chemist, so I can't tell you exactly what's going on in there, but it causes it to puff or swell, and things usually can get more violent from there. They are known to catch on fire. That is, if they get punctured or overcharged is generally when I see them go up.
Yeah.
And that's usually pure negligence on the battery. I have never seen one just sitting here on the table explode. Yeah, hopefully it doesn't happen. The camera's right in front of it. But usually the wrong setting has been put on the charger, or the battery's been plugged into the car, forgotten outside.
Turned off the lithium cutoff, the LiPo cutoff, and the ESC, blah, blah, blah.
You smashed into something, the battery went flying and punctured and...
So if you have a LiPo battery, and so there's, I'll call it swelling, which is okay. There's a certain amount of it's a little bit fluffier than it used to be.
Right.
That's normal. There is a certain amount of expansion that comes with the lithium chemistry.
Right.
Should have grabbed a blown up one.
But if it puffs to the point where it pops the case open, take it outside, put it in the dirt. It's done. Don't leave it in your house.
You can throw them in a bucket of salt water to discharge them all the way.
Right. The salt water will basically bring them to true dead. Then you can, and I think it's like leave them for a couple of days.
Right.
Then you can put them in the trash without worrying about burning down your garage.
Or the garbage man's truck.
Depends if you like it.
It's his problem.
But a lot of stores, they have disposable containers that you can put them in.
Right.
And they dispose them for you.
Yeah, the drop boxes or whatever
Right.
there. Anyway, aside from the batteries catching on fire, we're talking. So specs on the battery. So the 2-cell corresponds. I'll try to hold this in the camera here. Basically, the cell count and the voltage are exactly the same thing. When the cell count goes up, the voltage goes up. For every 1 cell, the voltage, or every 1 cell it goes up, the voltage goes up 3.7 volts.
Right.
And that's across. So if you're looking for a 3-cell battery, it'll be 11.1 volts, as Olin was saying before. And then a 4-cell, 14.8, and add 3.7 volts every time you go up.
Yep.
So that's basically the cell count and the voltage. More voltage it generally equates to more power, which generally equates to more RPM. But with more RPM comes more heat. So you got to be careful running bigger batteries. Either make sure your equipment's rated for it and keep an eye on the temperatures. That's a big thing. You can cook a motor or a speed control really fast with the big battery. If you get a 3-cell, 10,000 milliamp battery and you run it for 35 minutes up and down your road, I mean, you're gonna blow something up.
Yeah.
So
the motor's going to have
your car needs a brake, man.
that smell.
Your car needs a brake.
And most manufacturers like Traxxas, they'll advertise a car, 70 miles an hour if you get this battery and you do this gearing. So sometimes when you go up in voltage, because you get all that extra RPM, you may want to re-gear the vehicle to make sure that you keep it, safe.
Gearing to battery choice is a big thing. But talking more about the specs here, the 5000 mAh or milliamp hours is just, I always tell people it's the size of the fuel tank.
Yep.
Right.
The bigger the number,
The longer the runtime.
the longer the runtime.
Yep.
And like I just mentioned before, the longer the runtime is not always the best thing. If you got a huge battery, maybe your car is only, maybe you're overheating after 20 minutes, but your battery will go for 40.
Right.
You're gonna have to. This is gonna be something you're gonna have to check.
Just because you can run longer doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. But generally, the milliamp is the fuel tank and how long you can drive the car for. Bigger milliamp, more runtime.
Yep.
Yeah, in a nutshell. And then after that, there is C rating, which is good. And I mean, generally, a higher C rating is generally equates to a higher quality battery. Correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, but I think I usually equate C rating to like cranking amps in a car battery. Like higher cranking amps generally has more initial power to give to the motor without hurting the battery.
So I think that's accurate. The illustration I usually use is trying to drink through a straw.
Okay.
A low C rating means that it's going to be a lot harder for that motor to pull power out of the battery.
Right.
The higher the C rating, the bigger the straw, the easier it is to pull the juice, to pull the power out of the battery. So, for most of your bashers, you're good with 30, 40, 50 C. Mm-hmm. And this is where you get down that rabbit hole where if you're running a power limited class like 17.5 buggy, you want a really high C rating so that motor can get every ounce of juice it wants immediately. But yeah, basically C rating is how hard is it to get the goodness out of the battery?
The goodness.
The goodness.
So C rating is definitely at some points has a diminishing rate of return. If you're running a small car and it's not really using much battery, you don't need a 200C battery to run your, a 30C battery might be doing fine. But if you're running a speed run car and you're ringing the thing out,
200 amps.
Yeah, you want the highest C rating you can get because it's going to actually use that power.
Right.
So you don't have to go crazy with your ready to run car and be like, I need a 150C graphene battery because you're not going to hurt anything. It's not a bad thing.
No,
it's not a bad thing to have, but you might be spending $30, $40 more on a battery
that you don't need.
Yeah,
precisely.
Literally not gaining anything from it.
Right. So if you have a power combo that needs 50C, it can demand whatever 50C would provide. Going 60, 70, 80, good for you. But it's not going to make you a higher C rating beyond what the system can demand is not going to give you added power.
Like a fuel pump in a car.
Right. If you're too low,
not good.
It can
hurt the battery.
Slow you down. And yeah, so that actually I did that. I had again back in the short course days, I had a 4-wheel drive low C and I was running at the time like a 60 or 70 C 2-cell with a 4-pole 550 motor.
Bigger motor.
That's
like something like this he's got in there.
Kind of between like 10th scale and 8th scale.
Yeah.
And I puffed a battery or two. I had my lipo cut off at the right points. Everything was right. And what I determined was it was the current draw that I was running out in the dirt track. And that motor was trying to pull through that battery hard enough that the straw collapsed, and the battery wasn't happy.
Yeah, it's just asking for too much from the battery, and the batteries just can't deliver it.
Yep.
So, with that being said, you can never go wrong buying too high of a C battery, but you may be spending extra money that you don't really have to spend because your car is not going to draw the power.
Right.
So I know that can be a little confusing for some guys. When in doubt, I guess just get a little bit higher C rating because it's not going to hurt anything.
Right.
And it does leave you a little bit of room to grow if you're planning on upgrading or modifying things. And gearing will affect the C rating too. If you're going to gear this thing to the moon for speed.
Yep.
Usually, speed equates to higher C rating, essentially.
Fair.
Because crawling, you might be able to get away with a 30, 50 C battery and have no problem at all. And then you put that same battery in a speed run car, and your car is going to drive. The motor's going to ask for more than what that battery can give, but it's fine in another car.
Well, and the other thing about C rating is there is no industry standard.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's where, so with Basher
stickers.
batteries, with a Basher battery, it's get something that you know is matched to your car, you're fine. But, people going on Amazon buying, it's a 50C battery for, I don't know, like $20 or something. There are a lot of these batteries are coming from the same areas of the world where they can slap whatever they want on the label, and it's very difficult for you as the end user to pick the battery up and go, well, I'm going to test this and I'm going to prove it. So that's where having a reputable brand or a reputable shop that is going to sell you a good battery, and this is my rant on, I don't like Amazon for RC car stuff. I don't like the fly-by-night retailers, Hobby King, and stuff like that.
Because what you're saying, basically, and I know firsthand, is the battery, you can put any sticker on these things to say any number. I can make this a 10,000 C battery. It doesn't mean that it is.
What are you selling them for?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's literally just a label, and the average person, you don't really have a way to test C rating. You're more or less taking the label's word for it. So because you're getting a screaming deal on a 100C $20 battery, I could make this battery 200C in 10 minutes by putting a different sticker on it.
So, and
reputable brand.
Right. So that's why, like, Reedy, if you're looking at race packs, Reedy, Phantom, SMC, the New Wave stuff, like, you're getting them from a reputable source that's been in the industry for a long time.
Yeah.
And
tested them in a lot of different cars.
Yep. And the likelihood then is much higher that if you do get a bad pack, or if you have some sort of issue, you have somebody you can go back to. There's a number you can call. There's somebody you can yell at to get some sort of help versus sorry, try again.
Right.
Yeah. So you might get a screaming deal on a battery, and you know what? It might work out for you. You know what I mean? It's just fine. But you're paying $60 for a 2-cell versus $30 for a 2-cell. A lot of times you do get what you pay for, even if they are the same rating. I had actually a problem a little while back with a ready-to-run truck. They bought 50C 5,000 milliamp batteries.
On paper seems fine.
Yeah, I don't know the brand. They got them somewhere online. I'm not going to mention any names or anything. It was actually running 2 of them in a larger truck for a 4-cell. But he would drive it, and the thing would basically start stuttering at high end, and then kind of die early, and then the speed control would cut out, and everything seemed fine. And it was like, what's going on here? Then I took 2 of our New Wave packs, because there's the ones that we have, and I have a few on hand. I put 2 New Wave packs in, which on paper were exactly the same battery.
Truck ran flawless,
and it was fast as ever.
Yep.
So you got to be careful where you're getting these batteries from. I'm sure there's reviews out there for all kinds of brands. Check them out, see what people are running them in, see what their experience is with customer service, and try to make an educated decision.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely different quality batteries out there, and they're literally just stickers on these batteries. There's no national standard for any of this stuff that it has to pass any kind of test. It's just a sticker, literally.
Never underestimate the power of marketing.
Yeah, so aside from that rant of make good choices, there's one other thing I want to talk about the Lipo batteries, and it's charging them, because I get asked this a lot. Lithium batteries, opposed to nickel metals or NiCads, have a separate port, which is a balancing port. And essentially all this does is, this is got 3 wires because it's positive, negative, and then one, I guess, to the other cell.
Cell 1, cell 2,
Neutral.
common.
Yeah. So the bigger the battery, or the higher the cell, the more wires will be in this. But essentially, all this does is it plugs into your charger, and this plugs into your charger, and this just allows your charger to monitor the battery cells, so it knows that each one is getting charged equally, aka balanced. So when someone says a balanced charger, they're essentially saying it's a lithium battery charger that's balancing the battery while it's charging. And this is really important because if you don't plug this little guy in and you're just plugging in the main leads, the charger doesn't care. It'll just pump in voltage, and maybe one of those cells in there isn't charging and the other one is, and essentially charging one cell twice as much as the other. Boom.
Right.
Goes right up. Flame, fireworks, the whole show. And it is not clean, and it's pretty gross.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And scary.
Yeah. So the balancing is pretty important, and that's what that little plug is coming off of these batteries. I get asked this every day in the shop. You need to plug in the balance port when you're charging it, and you need to plug in the main lead.
Hard stop.
That's
like,
it.
No questions.
End of story. Because things can get dangerous fast if the charger is not monitoring this. And generally, if there's a problem with the battery, if it's a decent charger, at least all the ones I've seen, will start beeping some kind of error code at you saying, hey, cell voltage is incorrect, or incorrect number of cells, or whatever it says. There's something going wrong. Either you've hooked it up wrong or your battery's bad.
Right.
So that is very important, and it can save you from a house fire. So I'm serious about that.
And then battery maintenance is another thing to
Yeah,
keep in
go
mind
ahead.
too.
Go ahead.
That's a good subject.
Yeah, because like a lot of people think like, oh, I can just run this battery and not pay attention to.
Goes back in the garage.
Correct. You want to pay attention to the case, make sure there's no cracks. Pay attention to the wires. Make sure.
Have a crack in it actually.
Well,
this is
It's also a used pack.
Yeah, this one's pretty beat up. I had it sitting in the back. I don't maintain it very well.
Anyway.
Whoops.
But a
Hypocrite.
small crack in the case is not gonna do a lot. You can see even with this crack, it's not puffy. You can pretty much put
good
that.
to keep an eye on physical damage, basically.
Yeah.
Because if let's say this crack was worse and this part of the let me get in the camera. This part of the case was puffed out. You could see that the battery is puffing, and you should not continue to use it.
Right.
Because that damaged part of the whichever cell 1 or cell 2, there's a damaged cell, and with that damaged cell, it could spark, and if it sparks, you have a fire.
Punctured in any way.
Yeah.
Yeah. The puncture is a big deal.
Correct. And then your balance cords, like you said, positive, negative. If you see any tear in these wire cases, don't use them.
That's true.
Stop, because if you try to charge it and these arc, it's going to be bad very quickly.
Yeah, shorting out a lithium battery is much more potentially catastrophic than a NiCad or a nickel metal battery where it's like, oops, it sparked, I'll just stop doing that.
No.
With those, that's when you can potentially get into a runaway.
Right, because the spark could chain reaction to the chemicals that's inside this battery, and you might think like, oh, it just arced, it's fine. No, something's wrong.
Yeah, get it out,
something's
get
going
it out of the
on.
house.
Right.
Just because you can't see it yet.
It's coming. And I've seen customers come in like, hey, I was charging this battery, and all of a sudden it just puffed up. Well, take it outside. Don't bring it in the shop.
I know.
Because
I also have a tank of propane I'd like you to fill. I brought it in.
Because I'm sorry, but I'm not touching that battery. I'm not doing anything with it. Take it outside and just get rid of it, because once I see like a wire frayed or a puffy battery, I wouldn't mess with it myself, so I'm not going to tell you to play with something that could potentially harm.
Olam has left the chat.
Yeah, I'm like, listen, you can do whatever you want. I'm not touching it. I've had a customer get upset with me about it, but I'm like, listen, if for your own safety, take that outside. It's not
anyway.
worth.
If it's puffing to the point where the case is popping and wires are sparking, that thing's done anyway.
Right.
We're not charging it anymore.
Well, so and also when we're on the subject of general maintenance, storage charger batteries, please.
Yeah.
If
We'll break it down for them. What is that?
Yeah, so not unlike other batteries, older chemistries of batteries had certain ways they preferred to be stored. So like NiCad nickel metal, way back in the day, we would run them with light bulbs to a fully dead battery and then short across the plus and the minus.
And when you say dead, you're 0 voltage.
I mean,
light
deader than a doornail. The light bulb won't even come on.
Yep.
That's the old stuff. Nobody does that anymore. With lithiums, and I've seen guys like come back into the hobby after 20 years. They're like, so are we still dead short in lithium batteries? Like, is that still the method?
Nope.
No. With a lithium battery, you run it, so we'll say 2-cell. You charge to 8.4, you run it down to
6. 3 volts a cell is dead on a lithium battery.
Okay. So I
At bare minimum.
I usually don't go below 7. But this is with race stuff.
Right.
You don't go below that, which is just good. But 3 volts per cell is dead, not 0. 3.
Right.
So just to clarify that.
So you finish your run, the battery's dead, whether it's my definition of dead or dead like Tyler said. Don't put it away like that. If you're too low, it creates a safety hazard. Even if it's not too low, it's not good for the life of the battery to sit like that. So all lithium capable chargers have what they call a storage mode or a storage charge. So again, you plug in your balancing port, you plug the battery itself in, and then it will bring that battery up to typically...
Well, nominal voltage, so it should bring it to 7.4.
Yeah, I think my Orion goes like 7.6 or something
Well,
like that.
different chargers, you can set the storage cutoff, but
Correct.
generally nominal voltage, which is 3.7 volts, is
Right.
considered a 50% charge, and
Right,
anywhere from 30% to 60% I consider storage.
right.
So
So
it's not really a set number, I guess.
when you've done that, you've kind of left the battery in a neutral state where it's safe to store it. You know, again, I suppose we should caveat this with in a Lipo fireproof storage box or sack or whatever. You should never store lithium batteries just, on the table or in your bedroom or on a pile of newspapers or whatever. Store them properly in the right container. But when you're at that voltage, that's the safe voltage to store them. And it's also the voltage that you can leave a battery for an extended period of time, weeks or months, without potentially taking life off of it. Don't store them fully charged, obviously.
Yeah, just generally take care of it. And just, I think we covered a lot of it, but I think I got 2 more things I want to talk about, which is pertaining to charging. One is how fast said battery should be charged. Because generally, I mean, a lot of chargers will charge a battery faster than it should be charged. So basically, the rule of thumb for most batteries is this is a 5,200 milliamp battery. If you move the decimal point 1 spot over, it is a 5.2. So this battery at a 1C charge rate would be safe to charge at 5.2 amps. That is considered a 1C charge rate. Now I don't know, so this battery does have it on the back, but it is pretty scratched up, so I don't know if you'll be able to see it. But this battery on the back says it is safe to charge it at a 2C charge rate. So essentially all that is you take your 5.2 and multiply it by 2. This battery is considered safe to charge at 10.4 amps. Okay? So don't sit there and blast it on your big charger at 20 amps or 25 amps because you're going to hurt the battery.
Yeah, so the trade-off there, and like the hardcore race guys will do this. They'll whack a battery at high charge current to put heat into it because that lowers the internal resistance and they get more power out of it.
Tyler.
Yada yada yada. But at the end of the day, if you don't understand what you're doing when you do that to a battery, if you don't have solid reasons to disobey the instructions, don't do it.
You really have to know what you're doing, right. And just when all else fails, charge the battery a little bit slower because it's never going to hurt the battery to charge it slower. If anything, it gives it a little bit more of a complete charge.
Yep, because it soaks it in.
So rule of thumb: 1C. Take the decimal point. This would be 5.2. If it was 1,000 milliamps, it'd be 1 amp. 350 milliamps, 0.35 amps, and so on and so forth. You can more or less never go wrong doing it that way. And then once you do figure out the amp rate to charge said battery at, don't charge it unmonitored. Don't set it on a charge and then just leave for lunch. Because you never know when things are going to go wrong. Everything could be reading right, balance is good, battery's charging good, voltage is good. Things happen, man.
Yep.
And,
it could be wear in the battery. It could be a hiccup in the charger.
You don't know. So usually I tell people to stick it in a place. If you're not going to sit there and watch it charge for 45 minutes with your eyes on it. I usually say if you got like a garage floor, charge it on a garage floor or a tile floor or something like that. Or don't charge it up against a stack of paper or
gas
Tyler
can.
said newspaper, gas can. Use a little bit of responsibility. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just keep an eye on it while you're charging. I mean, not for nothing, lithium is a fairly volatile. I think it's a metal. Yeah.
It's explosive.
Yeah. So just.
And I mean, there's if you're that bad at planning your day, or planning like when you need to get your batteries charged, if you're the kind of dude that can't like put a Pop-Tart in the toaster and you have to microwave your Pop-Tart, this slow your roll.
Right.
You need to reevaluate.
Microwave Pop-Tarts.
What?
What?
It's
Anyway.
not the same. That's not okay.
Anyway,
Toaster oven.
I think that about wraps up batteries. Voltage is the number of cells. More voltage, more speed. Higher milliamp, more runtime.
Yep.
C rating. Usually more is better, but not always necessary.
Yep.
Make sure you charge it balanced and set the correct amperage. And don't
Storage
leave it.
charge them.
Yeah, take care of them. Don't leave them out in the rain. Storage charge them. Don't toss them around, and they'll suit you good. You'll have it. Like this one here, I actually have from 2019.
Yeah.
It's still in fairly good shape.
I have race packs that have not degraded in 3 years.
Got the date written right on this one. But I think that about wraps up servos, motors, speed controls, and batteries. Obviously, I'm sure some people listening are saying, "Oh my God, you forgot to talk about this and that." And we definitely did glaze over some stuff. It definitely can get more technical on each one of these things that we talked about. But just generally, knowing what you're putting it in and what you want out of it, there's a huge spectrum and spread of electronics in each of these categories that will do different things for different applications. So just knowing what you want to get out of the car and talking, it's going to come down to actually talking to somebody that knows electronics. Hopefully it's the guy behind the counter or whatever store you're at, or researching on YouTube or watching a podcast or hitting me up on the messenger. But anyway, I think that's a show. I want to thank Tyler and Olin for coming on with me and wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving because it will be live then. And also check out RC Madness because we're going to be doing some Black Friday sales. So check out our Facebook page. But yeah, happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for watching, guys. We will see you all again next week.
Later.
See ya.
See you guys.